What if everything you believed about the worst day of your life turned out to be a lie? What if the people you trusted most were the very ones who stole your entire world from you? And what if, after 46 years of grief, 46 years of unanswered prayers, 46 years of believing your children were dead, you discovered they had been alive the whole time, living just 300 miles away? This is not fiction. This is not a movie. This is the true story of Margaret Ellen Holloway, a woman who spent nearly half a century mourning the loss of her twin daughters, only to uncover a truth so devastating, so shocking, that it would shake the foundations of everything she ever knew about family, love, and betrayal. And when she finally discovered who was responsible, she made sure they faced justice, no matter how long it took. Before I tell you this story, I need you to do something for me. If you have ever lost someone, if you have ever wondered what happened to a person you loved, if you believe that the truth always finds a way to surface no matter how long it takes, then you need to share this video right now. Send it to someone who needs to hear this story. Subscribe to this channel because what I am about to reveal will change how you see the world. This is a story about the unbreakable bond between a mother and her children, about justice delayed but not denied, and I promise you, by the end, you will understand why some secrets refuse to stay buried forever. It was the summer of 1979. The air in Bakersfield, California hung thick with heat, the kind of oppressive warmth that made children seek refuge in swimming pools and mothers keep curtains drawn until evening. Margaret Holloway was 26 years old, a young mother with strawberry blonde hair and tired eyes that still managed to sparkle when she looked at her twin daughters, Sarah and Emma. The girls were 4 years old, identical in every way except for the small birthmark behind Sarah's left ear. They had their mother's fair complexion and their father's dark curls, and when they laughed, which was often, the sound filled their modest two-bedroom house like music. Margaret worked part-time at a diner 3 blocks from their home while her mother-in-law, Dorothy Holloway, watched the girls. Her husband, Robert, worked long shifts at the oil refinery, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, his hands perpetually stained despite his best efforts to scrub them clean. Life was not easy, but it was good. Margaret believed in the simple mathematics of happiness: a roof overhead, food on the table, and 2 healthy children who called her mama. She did not ask for much. She did not expect much. And perhaps that was why the universe decided to take everything from her in a single afternoon. August 14th started like any other Tuesday. Margaret kissed her daughters goodbye at 7:30 in the morning, promising them she would bring home the chocolate cake from the diner that the cook always saved for her. Sarah clung to her leg for an extra moment, something she rarely did, and Margaret would replay that embrace in her mind for the next 4 decades, searching for meaning in the gesture, wondering if somehow her daughter had known. Dorothy Holloway was waiting in the kitchen, already pouring apple juice into plastic cups with cartoon characters on them. She smiled at Margaret, that tight-lipped smile she always wore, and assured her the girls would be fine. They were always fine. Dorothy had raised 3 children of her own, and she reminded Margaret of this fact regularly. The shift at the diner was uneventful. Margaret served eggs and coffee to the morning regulars, wiped down tables, and chatted with her co-worker about nothing important. At 2:15 in the afternoon, she began untying her apron, already picturing the look on her daughters' faces when she walked through the door with their favorite cake. But when she arrived home, the house was silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that presses against your eardrums and makes your heart beat faster before your mind even registers why. The front door was unlocked, which was unusual. Dorothy always locked the door. Margaret called out, first softly, then louder. She moved through the living room, past the toys scattered on the carpet, past the television that was still on but muted, into the kitchen where 2 cups of apple juice sat untouched on the table. She found Dorothy in the backyard, standing perfectly still, staring at the gate that led to the alley behind their property. The gate was open, swinging slightly in the hot afternoon breeze. The girls were gone. What followed was chaos, the kind of organized pandemonium that only tragedy can orchestrate. Police officers arrived within minutes. Neighbors flooded the streets calling the twins names, and Robert came home from work with his face the color of ash, his hands shaking as he held Margaret while she screamed into his chest. Dorothy told the police she had put the girls down for their nap at 1 o'clock. When she went to check on them at 2, their bedroom was empty. The window was open. The gate to the backyard, which was always latched, was standing wide. The investigation lasted months. Detectives interviewed every neighbor, every registered offender within 50 miles, every person who had ever shown even passing interest in the Holloway family. They found nothing. No witnesses. No ransom demands. No bodies. Sarah and Emma Holloway had vanished as completely as if they had never existed at all. The prevailing theory, the one the police eventually settled on, was that a transient had seen the opportunity and taken it. Bakersfield sat along major trucking routes, and drifters passed through regularly. It was possible, the detective told Margaret, that her daughters were already hundreds of miles away by the time anyone realized they were missing. It was possible they would never be found. Margaret refused to accept this. She put up flyers until her fingers bled from paper cuts. She appeared on local news programs, begging whoever had taken her children to bring them home. She hired a private investigator who took her money and delivered nothing but sympathy. She drove Robert away with her obsession, and their marriage crumbled like wet paper within 2 years of the disappearance. But she never stopped looking, never stopped hoping, never stopped believing that somewhere, somehow, her daughters were alive and waiting for her to find them. The years passed with brutal indifference. 1979 became 1989, then 1999, then 2009. Margaret aged in ways that had nothing to do with time. Her hair turned gray, her back curved slightly forward as if she was perpetually bracing for another blow, and her eyes, once bright with hope, dimmed to a resignation that those who knew her found almost unbearable to witness. She never had other children. How could she? Every child would have been a reminder of what she had lost, a poor substitute for the daughters who visited her in dreams so vivid she would wake up reaching for them. By 2025, Margaret Holloway was 72 years old. She lived alone in a small apartment in Sacramento, having left Bakersfield decades ago because the memories there were too heavy to carry. She had few friends, no remaining family, and only one photograph of her twins that she kept on her nightstand, kissing it every night before she slept. She had given up hope of ever finding them. She had made peace with the probability that they had died all those years ago, taken by some monster who had discarded them like garbage when he was finished with whatever unspeakable things he had done. The not knowing was its own kind of death, and Margaret had learned to live with it the way one learns to live with a chronic illness. But the universe was not finished with Margaret Holloway. Not by a long shot. The package arrived on a Tuesday, 46 years to the day since Margaret's daughters had disappeared. She did not notice the date at first, had stopped marking it on calendars years ago because the annual reminder was too painful to bear. But later, when she had time to reflect on everything that happened, the symmetry would seem almost deliberate, as if fate itself had a sense of poetic timing. The package was small, brown paper wrapping with no return address. Her name was typed on a white label, nothing personal about it, and for a moment she considered throwing it away unopened. She received so little mail these days, mostly advertisements and medical bills, and anything unexpected made her nervous. But something about the weight of the package intrigued her. It was heavier than paper, lighter than a book. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that smelled faintly of lavender, was a gold locket on a thin chain. Margaret recognized it immediately, and the sound that escaped her throat was something between a gasp and a scream. This was her locket, the one her grandmother had given her when she was 16, the one she had given to Sarah on the twins' 4th birthday, planning to give an identical one to Emma when they turned 5, the one that had disappeared with her daughter 46 years ago. Her hands trembled so violently she nearly dropped it. She pressed the tiny clasp on the side, and the locket opened to reveal what she knew would be there. A photograph of herself and Robert on their wedding day, impossibly young, impossibly happy, impossibly unaware of what the future held. There was a note inside the package, A single piece of paper with a typed message that Margaret read 7 times before the words finally registered in her brain. Your daughters are alive. They need you. If you want to find them, go to 445 Maple Street, Fresno. Ask for Rachel. Tell her Dorothy sent you. Margaret sat in her kitchen for 3 hours, staring at the locket and the note, unable to move. Her mind raced through possibilities, each more unlikely than the last. A scam, a cruel joke, a trap designed to prey on a grieving old woman. But the locket was real. The locket was proof that whoever had sent this package knew something about that day in 1979. And the name Dorothy. Robert's mother had died in 1992, taking whatever secrets she possessed to her grave. Or so Margaret had believed. She picked up the phone and called the only person she thought might help her, Detective William Santos, the grandson of the man who had originally investigated her daughter's disappearance. Santos worked cold cases for the Bakersfield Police Department, and Margaret had contacted him years ago, hoping new technology might yield new leads. It had not, but he had been kind to her, and she trusted him as much as she trusted anyone. Santos listened to her story without interruption. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment before speaking. Margaret, I need you to be very careful here. This could be nothing. It could be someone trying to manipulate you, take advantage of your grief. But you're right about one thing. That locket should not exist. It was documented in the original case file as missing along with your daughters. If someone has it now, they know something. He paused, and Margaret could hear him thinking through the phone. I want to come with you. If this leads somewhere real, if there is evidence of a crime, we need to document everything properly. This could be the break we have been waiting for, and I do not want procedural mistakes to let anyone walk free. Margaret agreed, and they arranged to meet the following morning. She spent the night unable to sleep, holding the locket against her heart, praying to a God she had stopped believing in decades ago. The drive from Sacramento to Fresno took 2.5 hours. Detective Santos drove while Margaret sat in the passenger seat, gripping the locket with both hands, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. She replayed the last morning with her daughters in her mind, searching for details she might have missed. Dorothy's tight-lipped smile, Sarah's unusual clinginess, the apple juice sitting untouched on the table. Small things, meaningless things. Except now they seemed to form a pattern she could not quite see. The address led them to a modest house on a quiet residential street, the kind of neighborhood where children rode bicycles on sidewalks and neighbors waved to each other from front porches. Santos parked across the street, and they sat in the car for several minutes, discussing strategy. Let me do the initial talking, Santos said. If this person knows something about a kidnapping, I need to establish that this is an official investigation. Anything they say could be used as evidence later. Margaret nodded, though patience was the last thing she felt capable of in that moment. They walked to the front door and knocked. The woman who answered was perhaps 50 years old, with graying brown hair and eyes that held a weariness Margaret recognized as her own. She looked at Margaret for a long moment, taking in the elderly woman's face, her trembling hands, the desperate hope that radiated from her entire being. You're Margaret, the woman said. It was not a question. I am. I received a package. A locket. A note. It said to ask for Rachel and tell her Dorothy sent me. The woman's face crumpled, and for a moment Margaret thought she would slam the door. Instead, she noticed Detective Santos and his badge, and her expression shifted to something like relief. You brought the police. Good. I was hoping you would. My name is Rachel Peterson. Dorothy Holloway was my grandmother, and I have been waiting 46 years to tell someone the truth about what happened to your daughters. Rachel led them to a small living room cluttered with photographs and books. Margaret noticed immediately that many of the photographs featured 2 women who looked remarkably similar, dark-haired and fair-skinned, their smiles strangely familiar. But she forced herself to focus on Rachel, who was settling into a chair with the air of someone about to unburden themselves of a terrible weight. Detective Santos took out a recorder. Ms. Peterson, before we begin, I need to inform you that this conversation is being recorded. Anything you say may be used as evidence in a criminal investigation. Do you understand? I understand, Rachel said. And I want it on record. All of it. I have been carrying this secret for 6 months, ever since I discovered the truth, and it has been destroying me. I need to tell someone. I need this to be official. Please proceed, Santos said. Rachel took a deep breath. 6 months ago, I received notification from a bank in Bakersfield. My grandmother Dorothy had maintained a safe deposit box there for decades, prepaying the rental so far in advance that it remained untouched even after her death in 1992. When the bank finally decided to clear out old accounts, they contacted me as her closest living relative. She paused, gathering herself. Inside the box, I found letters, documents, photographs, and this. She gestured to the locket Margaret still clutched. There was also a journal, my grandmother's journal, and in that journal, she confessed everything. Margaret leaned forward. What did she confess? That she orchestrated the disappearance of your daughters. That she planned it for months. That she executed it with the help of her sister, my great-aunt Harriet, and several other people who were part of what I can only describe as an underground network. And that she told everyone, including my mother, that she was rescuing Sarah and Emma from a dangerous home environment. The words hit Margaret like physical blows. She sat perfectly still, unable to speak, unable to process what she was hearing. That is a lie, she finally managed. Our home was not dangerous. I loved my daughters more than anything in this world. Robert never laid a hand on me or the children. I know that now, Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion. But my grandmother was convincing. She told my mother, told everyone in her circle, that Robert was abusing you and the girls. She claimed she had witnessed things, terrible things, and that she had to act to protect her granddaughters. My mother believed her. Everyone believed her. Detective Santos interjected. You mentioned a network. Can you elaborate on that? Rachel nodded. My grandmother's journal describes a group of people who believe they were doing good by taking children from what they perceived as bad situations and placing them with better families. It was not a formal organization, more like a loose network of true believers. There was a social worker named Gloria Whitman who identified potential cases. A family court clerk named Harold Jensen who helped create false documentation. A doctor named Peter Carmichael who provided falsified medical records and death certificates. She pulled out a folder from beneath her chair and handed it to Santos. This is everything I found. Names, dates, addresses. Records of payments made to the adoptive families. Forged death certificates for Margaret and Robert Holloway. Letters between my grandmother and her co-conspirators discussing the placement of Sarah and Emma. Santos flipped through the documents, his expression growing grimmer with each page. Ms. Peterson, are you aware that what you are describing constitutes kidnapping, fraud, falsification of legal documents, and potentially child trafficking? I am aware, Rachel said quietly. That is why I contacted Margaret. That is why I am cooperating with you. These people destroyed lives, and they convinced themselves they were heroes for doing it. Someone needs to hold them accountable. Margaret found her voice. My daughters. Where are they? Rachel stood and walked to the wall of photographs. She removed one from its frame and handed it to Margaret. This is Sarah. She goes by Susan now. She lives in Portland, Oregon with her husband and 3 children. She is 50 years old, healthy, and successful. She works as an accountant. She believes her birth parents died in a car accident when she was 4. Margaret stared at the photograph of a dark-haired woman with her own eyes, her own smile, the ghost of her father in the shape of her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks unchecked. And Emma? Rachel handed her another photograph. Emma goes by Emily. She lives in Henderson, Nevada. She is a nurse at a hospital there. She has 2 daughters of her own. She also believes her birth parents died in an accident. Margaret clutched both photographs to her chest, sobbing with a grief and joy so intertwined she could not distinguish between them. Her babies. Her beautiful babies. Alive. Grown. Mothers themselves now. Let me ask you something right now. Take a moment to really think about this. If you were in Margaret's shoes, if you had just discovered that your children had been stolen by someone you trusted, hidden from you for 46 years, and raised to believe you were dead, what would you do first? Would you focus on reuniting with your children, or would you need to see justice served before you could move forward? Drop your answer in the comments below because I truly want to know what you would do in this impossible situation. Detective Santos spoke gently. Margaret, I know this is overwhelming, but I need to ask you some questions while the information is fresh. We have potential evidence of multiple felonies here, and I want to make sure we handle this correctly. Margaret wiped her eyes and nodded. What do you need to know? The people Rachel mentioned. Gloria Whitman, Harold Jensen, Peter Carmichael. Do any of those names mean anything to you? Margaret thought back, reaching through decades of memory. Gloria Whitman. I think yes. She came to our house once, a few weeks before the girls disappeared. She said she was from Child Protective Services, doing a routine wellness check. I thought it was strange at the time, but she seemed so official. She asked questions about Robert's work schedule, about our childcare arrangements. Santos made a note. She was scouting you, gathering information for the abduction. And the doctor, Margaret continued, realization dawning. Peter Carmichael. He was the one who told me Dorothy had died of heart failure in 1992. He signed her death certificate. I never questioned it. He was likely covering up any evidence that might have led back to the network, Santos said. These people were careful. They had systems in place to protect themselves. Rachel spoke again. My grandmother's journal mentions other children too. Not by name, but she refers to cases and placements going back to the early 1970s. Sarah and Emma were not the only ones. Santos closed the folder with a grim expression. Then we have a lot more work to do. Margaret, I need to take this evidence back to my department. I want to bring in the FBI as well, since this appears to cross state lines. Are you willing to cooperate with a full investigation? I will do whatever it takes, Margaret said firmly. I want my daughters back, but I also want the people who did this to face justice. All of them. Whatever it takes, however long it takes. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected. Within a week of Margaret's visit to Rachel's house, a task force had been assembled, combining resources from the Bakersfield Police Department, the FBI's Crimes Against Children Unit, and the district attorneys of 3 different California counties. The evidence Rachel had provided was damning. Dorothy Holloway's journal contained meticulous records of every placement she had orchestrated, going back to 1971. 17 children in total had been taken from their families and given to new ones, their identities erased, their histories rewritten. Some of the birth parents had died never knowing what happened. Others were still alive, still searching, still hoping. The first arrest came 2 weeks after the task force was formed. Harold Jensen, the former family court clerk, was now 71 years old and living in a retirement community in San Diego. When FBI agents arrived at his door with a warrant, he tried to claim he could not remember anything from that long ago. But when they showed him the documents bearing his signature, forged birth certificates, and falsified court orders, he broke down and confessed. Jensen revealed that he had been recruited by Dorothy Holloway in 1969. She had approached him at a church function, speaking passionately about children who needed to be saved from abusive homes. The legal system was too slow, she said. Too many children fell through the cracks. She proposed an alternative: identify children at risk, place them with families who would love them properly, and create the paperwork to make it all legal. I thought I was doing God's work, Jensen told investigators, weeping. Dorothy was so convincing. She had this way of making you feel like a hero. By the time I realized what we were really doing, it was too late. I was too deep in. She had evidence of everything I had done. She could have destroyed me. He provided names of everyone he knew who had been involved. Some were already dead, including Dorothy herself and Peter Carmichael, the doctor who had provided false medical records. But others were still alive. Gloria Whitman, the social worker who had scouted the Holloway home before Sarah and Emma were taken, was arrested in Phoenix, Arizona. She was 74 years old and living with her daughter, who had no idea her mother had spent decades participating in child trafficking. Gloria was less cooperative than Harold Jensen, insisting that everything she had done was legal and proper. Those children were in danger, she told investigators. The system would not protect them, so we did. We saved lives. We gave those children better futures than they ever would have had otherwise. When confronted with the evidence that she had falsified reports, manufactured claims of abuse, and helped separate children from loving parents, Gloria finally fell silent. Her attorney advised her to stop talking, but the damage was done. Her recorded statements would be used against her at trial. The third living conspirator was the one Margaret most wanted to face. Harriet Chambers, Dorothy's sister, was 89 years old and living in a nursing home in Bakersfield. She was the one who had physically transported Sarah and Emma from their home to their new families. She was the one who had handed Margaret's children to strangers and walked away. Margaret insisted on being present for Harriet's interview. Detective Santos was reluctant at first, concerned about compromising the investigation, but ultimately agreed that Margaret had earned the right to face her children's kidnapper. The Bakersfield Sunset Care Facility was a low-slung building painted in institutional beige, surrounded by carefully maintained gardens that did little to disguise its purpose. This was where people came to fade away, and Margaret felt a grim satisfaction knowing that Harriet Chambers had spent her declining years in such a colorless place. She was not there for satisfaction, though. She was there for answers. Harriet's room was small, dominated by a hospital bed and medical equipment. The woman in the bed seemed too frail to have caused so much damage. She was skeleton-thin, her skin papery and spotted with age, an oxygen tube running to her nostrils. But when her cloudy eyes focused on Margaret, there was recognition there. And fear. "You," Harriet whispered. "After all these years. You found out." Detective Santos stepped forward. "Harriet Chambers, I am Detective William Santos with the Bakersfield Police Department. We are here regarding the 1979 disappearance of Sarah and Emma Holloway, as well as other cases involving the illegal removal of children from their families. We have evidence linking you to multiple counts of kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy." Harriet's papery hand fluttered on the blanket. "I always knew this day would come. Dorothy said it would not. She said you would give up and move on. But I knew. A mother never stops looking for her children." "You knew," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the fury in her heart. "You knew I was searching. You knew I was suffering. And you did nothing." "What could I have done?" Harriet asked weakly. "By the time I understood what Dorothy was really doing, it was too late. The children were placed. They were happy. Coming forward would have destroyed everything. For everyone. You stole my children," Margaret said. "You gave them to strangers. You created documents saying I was dead. You watched me put up flyers and go on television and beg for help. And you knew exactly where my daughters were the entire time." "I was afraid of Dorothy," Harriet admitted. "She was not well. She had delusions, obsessions. She convinced herself that she was saving children, that the parents she was taking them from were monsters. By the time I realized she was inventing the abuse, fabricating evidence, I was too deep in. She would have destroyed me." Detective Santos read Harriet her rights and informed her that she was under arrest. Given her age and medical condition, she would remain in the nursing facility under guard rather than being transferred to a jail, but she would face charges along with the others. "I want to make a deal," Harriet said suddenly. "I know things. Names of everyone who was involved. Families who received children. How the network operated. I will tell you everything if you promise I can stay here. If you do not move me to a prison hospital." Santos looked at Margaret. "That is not my decision to make. The district attorney will determine what kind of deal, if any, is appropriate." "I will give you everything," Harriet insisted. Dorothy kept records, but she did not write down the most important things. The personal connections. The favors that were exchanged. The money that changed hands. I was there for all of it. I remember everything. Over the following weeks, Harriet Chambers provided extensive testimony that helped investigators build cases against everyone who had participated in the network. She named families who had paid for children, community leaders who had looked the other way, and officials who had been bribed to ignore irregularities. The scope of the conspiracy was larger than anyone had imagined. What had begun as Dorothy Holloway's personal crusade had grown into a regional operation affecting families across California, Nevada, and Oregon. 17 children had been confirmed as victims, but investigators suspected there were more whose cases had never been properly documented. While the investigation continued, Margaret faced a different challenge: how to approach her daughters. Sarah and Emma had spent their entire lives believing their birth parents were dead. They had been raised by people they loved, built identities around stories that were complete fabrications. Learning the truth would shatter their understanding of who they were. Detective Santos arranged for a victim's advocate to help facilitate the contact. Dr. Evelyn Cross was a psychologist who specialized in reuniting families separated by trauma. She met with Margaret several times before reaching out to Sarah and Emma, helping her prepare for every possible reaction. They may be angry, Dr. Cross warned. Not at you, but at the situation. They may need time to process before they can accept what you are telling them. Some adoptees in these situations reject their birth families entirely, at least initially. You need to be prepared for that possibility. I have waited 46 years, Margaret said. I can wait longer if I have to. I just want them to know the truth. What they do with that truth is up to them. The first contact was made by letter. Dr. Cross helped Margaret compose a message that was gentle but honest, explaining who she was, what had happened in 1979, and how she had spent the decades since searching for them. She included copies of photographs from their early childhood, their birth certificates, and a summary of the investigation that was now underway. Sarah responded first. Her letter arrived 3 days after Margaret's was sent, written in careful handwriting that somehow reminded Margaret of her own. I do not know what to say. I do not know what to feel. Everything I believed about myself, about my family, about my history, is suddenly uncertain. I need time to process this. But I want you to know that I am not rejecting you. I am just overwhelmed. Please give me space, but do not give up on me. Emma's response came a week later, by phone. She called Margaret directly, her voice shaking with emotion. Is it really you? My birth mother? You are really alive. I am alive, Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. I have been alive this whole time, Emma. I never stopped looking for you. I never stopped loving you. They told us you died. They showed us a newspaper clipping about a car accident. We had a little memorial service when we were 7, me and Sarah both. We lit candles for you. Those people lied to you. They lied to everyone. But I am here now, and I want to know you. I want to be part of your life, if you will let me. The reunion was arranged for a Saturday afternoon, 3 weeks after Margaret's initial letters were sent. The location was a hotel conference room in Sacramento, neutral territory chosen to provide privacy and space for what everyone knew would be an emotionally intense encounter. Margaret arrived an hour early, wearing the nicest dress she owned and carrying a bag filled with photographs, the letters she had written to her daughters over the years and never sent, and the gold locket that had started everything. She paced the empty room, rehearsing speeches she knew she would forget, prayers she hoped would be answered, apologies for circumstances she had never controlled. At exactly 2 o'clock, the door opened. The first woman through was dark-haired with nervous eyes and her father's stubborn jawline. Sarah. Susan now, but Margaret could see her baby girl in every line of her face. Behind her came Emily, slightly taller than her sister, with a nurse's calm demeanor barely masking her terror. For a long moment, no one moved. 3 women separated by 46 years of lies stood frozen, the air thick with unspoken words. Then Sarah spoke, her voice trembling. I brought pictures too. Of my kids. Your grandkids, I guess. If you want to see them. Margaret's composure shattered. She crossed the room in 3 quick steps and pulled both women into an embrace so fierce it seemed designed to make up for every hug she had missed across nearly 5 decades. They stood that way for several minutes, crying, holding each other, 3 hearts beating together for the first time since August 14th, 1979. When they finally separated, Margaret took their hands and led them to a table where she had spread out photographs of their childhood, the few images she possessed from those first 4 years. This was your bedroom, she said, pointing to a picture of a small room with twin beds covered in matching quilts. I made those quilts myself. I had never sewn anything before, but I wanted you to have something I made with my own hands. Emma picked up a photograph of a young Margaret holding 2 infants. You look so young, so happy. I was. Those were the happiest years of my life. Having you 2 was everything I ever wanted. When you were taken, I felt like someone had removed my heart and expected me to keep living without it. Sarah wiped her eyes. We were told you died. Both of you, in a car accident. They said there were no other relatives, no one to claim us. We were placed with families who wanted children but could not have their own. The people who raised you, Margaret asked gently, were they good to you? Both women nodded. They were wonderful, Emma said. They loved us completely. That is what makes this so confusing. How do I reconcile the parents who raised me with the fact that they were lied to, that I was lied to, that my whole identity is built on something that was not true? Your identity is not a lie, Margaret said firmly. You are who you are because of the choices you made, the values you embraced, the people you love. The circumstances of how you came to your adoptive families were wrong, horribly wrong, but that does not invalidate the lives you have lived. You are my daughters by blood. You are their daughters by love. Both things can be true. The trials began in the spring of the following year. The media attention was intense, with reporters from across the country descending on the California courthouses where Harold Jensen, Gloria Whitman, and Harriet Chambers would face justice for their crimes. Margaret testified at each trial, recounting in painful detail the day her daughters disappeared, the decades of searching, the moment she received the package containing the locket. Her testimony was powerful, leaving jurors in tears and providing an emotional foundation for the prosecutor's cases. Sarah and Emma testified as well, describing the impact of learning that their entire identities had been built on lies. They spoke of their adoptive families with love, but also with the complicated grief of people who had been deceived by those they trusted most. Harold Jensen's trial was first. The former court clerk had pleaded not guilty, hoping to mount a defense based on his age and the time that had passed since the crimes. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. Documents in his handwriting, testimony from Harriet Chambers, and a paper trail that led directly to his desk. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Jensen was convicted of 17 counts of kidnapping, 17 counts of fraud, and numerous additional charges related to the falsification of legal documents. At sentencing, the judge acknowledged Jensen's age and failing health, but refused to show leniency. You participated in the systematic destruction of families, the judge said. You used your position of trust to facilitate crimes that robbed children of their identities and parents of their children. The passage of time does not diminish the severity of what you did. It only shows how long your victims have suffered. Harold Jensen was sentenced to 25 years to life in federal prison. Given his age, it was effectively a life sentence. He showed no emotion as he was led away in handcuffs. Gloria Whitman's trial followed 2 months later. Unlike Jensen, she maintained her defiance throughout, insisting that she had been motivated by a genuine desire to protect children from abuse. Her attorney attempted to portray her as a misguided idealist rather than a criminal. Margaret's testimony destroyed that defense. She described Gloria's visit to her home in the weeks before the abduction, the fake wellness check that had been used to gather information for the kidnapping. She described her happy family, her loving husband, the complete absence of any abuse or neglect. Other witnesses came forward as well. Parents of other stolen children testified about false reports Gloria had filed, fabricated evidence of abuse that had never existed. Social workers who had worked with her in the 1970s and 1980s described patterns of behavior that raised red flags even at the time. The jury was not swayed by Gloria's claims of good intentions. She was convicted on multiple counts of kidnapping, fraud, and conspiracy, and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. At 74, she would likely die behind bars. Harriet Chambers, due to her cooperation with investigators, received a reduced sentence. She was convicted of her role in the conspiracy, but was allowed to serve her time under house arrest at the nursing facility where she already resided. Given her deteriorating health, prosecutors agreed that moving her to a prison would amount to a death sentence, and her testimony had been crucial in building cases against the others. Margaret was not entirely satisfied with Harriet's outcome, but she accepted it as a necessary compromise. The most important thing was that the truth had come out. The people who had stolen her children had faced consequences. The network that had enabled them was dismantled, and investigators were working to reunite other families who had been torn apart by Dorothy Holloway's twisted crusade. But justice was not complete until Margaret dealt with one remaining piece of unfinished business. Dorothy Holloway was dead, beyond the reach of human courts. But her legacy of lies had continued long after her death, protected by a family that either did not know the truth or chose not to see it. Robert Holloway, Margaret's ex-husband and Dorothy's son, had remarried after their divorce. He had died in 2010, but his second wife, Linda, was still alive, living in the same Bakersfield neighborhood where Margaret's daughters had disappeared 50 years earlier. Margaret drove to that neighborhood on a sunny afternoon in June, parking in front of a house that had been extensively renovated but still stood on the same lot where Dorothy had watched the girls while Margaret worked at the diner. Linda Holloway answered the door with a suspicious expression that melted into recognition when she saw Margaret's face. "I wondered when you would come," Linda said quietly. "I saw the news. The trials. I know what happened now. Did you know before?" Margaret asked. Linda shook her head. "Robert never told me anything. When the investigation started, I went through his old papers, things he kept in storage. I found letters from his mother, letters that explained everything." She stepped aside and invited Margaret in. "I destroyed those letters," Linda admitted once they were seated in the living room. "I probably should not have. They might have been evidence, but I could not stand the thought of anyone seeing them. The things Dorothy wrote about you, the lies she convinced herself were true. It made me sick." "What did she say?" Linda was quiet for a moment. "She wrote that you were unfit, that Robert had made a terrible mistake marrying you, that the children deserved better than a mother who worked in a diner and came from nothing. She convinced herself that she was rescuing her granddaughters from poverty and neglect, giving them the kind of life she thought they deserved." Margaret felt the old anger rising but forced it down. "There was no abuse. There was no neglect. Robert and I loved our daughters more than anything." "I know," Linda said. "I know that now." But Dorothy was persuasive. She had this way of making people believe whatever she wanted them to believe. Robert worshipped his mother. He never questioned anything she said. "He knew," Margaret said. "He had to have known." Linda shook her head. "I do not think so. I truly believe Robert thought the girls were taken by a stranger. His grief was real. The destruction of your marriage was real. He spent the rest of his life haunted by what happened. If he had known his mother was responsible, I think it would have killed him." Margaret sat with that information, trying to reconcile it with her memories of the man she had once loved. Robert had been weak, easily manipulated by his mother, but he had genuinely loved their daughters. The idea that he had died without ever knowing the truth was somehow both a relief and another tragedy. "I'm sorry," Linda said, "for everything you went through, for everything this family put you through, even if most of us did not know we were doing it. I'm sorry." Margaret stood to leave. "Thank you for telling me. It does not change what happened, but it helps to understand." At the door, Linda caught her arm. "Your daughters, Sarah and Emma, are they well?" "They are," Margaret said, and for the first time in 46 years, the words felt completely true. "They are wonderful. They have families of their own, and I am part of their lives now." Finally, the months following the trials were a whirlwind of discovery and connection. Margaret moved from her lonely Sacramento apartment to a house in Portland, Oregon, just 15 minutes from Sarah and her family. Emma drove up from Nevada every other weekend, sometimes with her daughters, sometimes alone. The grandchildren, 5 in total ranging from teenagers to young adults, accepted Margaret with the uncomplicated grace of people who had no stake in the anger or grief of the past. To them, she was simply Grandma Maggie, an elderly woman who appeared suddenly in their lives bearing gifts and stories and an apparently infinite capacity for love. The adoptive parents were more complicated. Sarah's adoptive mother had passed away years earlier, but her adoptive father, David, was still alive, living in a memory care facility in Eugene. When Sarah told him the truth, he wept for hours, devastated to learn that the daughter he loved had been stolen from another woman who loved her just as much. "I didn't know," he told Margaret when she visited him. "They showed us paperwork, death certificates. We thought we were giving a home to an orphan. If I had known." "You loved her," Margaret said, taking his fragile hand. You gave her a good life. That is what matters now. David shook his head. I paid them. The people who arranged the adoption. I paid them $5,000, which was a fortune in 1979. I thought it was legal fees, administrative costs. But it was blood money, wasn't it? I paid for a stolen child. You were deceived. We all were. The only people who bear responsibility are the ones who orchestrated this, and they are facing justice now. Emma's adoptive parents had both passed, but their surviving relatives, cousins and aunts and uncles, reached out to Margaret with expressions of shock and sorrow. Some offered apologies. Others simply wanted to assure her that Emma had been loved, that despite the terrible beginning, her daughter had lived a good life. And Margaret believed them. She had seen the evidence in her daughters' faces, in their stable marriages and successful careers, in the confident, kind children they had raised. Whatever else Dorothy Holloway had done, she had chosen families who would love Sarah and Emma unconditionally. It was the one mercy in an otherwise merciless situation. The investigation continued to yield results. Using information from Harriet Chambers and evidence uncovered during the trials, investigators identified and contacted families of all 17 children who had been trafficked through the network. Not all of them had happy endings. Some of the taken children had died. Others wanted nothing to do with their birth families. A few could not be located. But several reunions did occur, families brought back together after 20, 30, even 50 years of separation. Margaret attended 3 of these reunions as a guest of honor, her presence a symbol of hope for parents who had spent decades in the same dark place she had inhabited. You gave me hope when I had none, one mother told her, clutching Margaret's hands while tears streamed down both their faces. My son was taken 28 years ago. After seeing your story on the news, I contacted the investigators. They found him last month. He is alive. Because of you, I have my son back. Margaret became an advocate for families of missing children, speaking at conferences and appearing in documentaries about long-term missing persons cases. She worked with law enforcement agencies to improve how they handled cold cases, pushing for more resources and better technology to help solve crimes that had gone unsolved for decades. She also started a foundation in Sarah and Emma's names, providing support to families searching for missing loved ones. The foundation offered financial assistance for private investigators, legal help for families navigating the court system, and counseling services for those dealing with the trauma of prolonged uncertainty. No one should have to go through what I went through, Margaret said at the foundation's launch event. And if they do, they should not have to go through it alone. On the first anniversary of their reunion, Margaret hosted a dinner at her Portland home. The table was crowded with her daughters, their spouses, all 5 grandchildren, Rachel Peterson and Detective Santos, who had become something of a family friend over the past year. The trials were behind them now. Justice had been served, imperfectly but meaningfully. The people who had stolen Margaret's children were dead or imprisoned. The network that had enabled them was dismantled. And while nothing could give back the 46 years that had been stolen, there was a sense of closure that Margaret had never expected to feel. Margaret stood at the head of the table, a glass of wine in her hand, looking at the faces of people who had been strangers just 12 months earlier and were now the most important people in her world. I want to make a toast, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. For 46 years, I dreamed of this moment. I imagined what it would be like to sit at a table surrounded by my family, to hear laughter and conversation, to feel like I belonged somewhere. The reality is better than anything I ever dreamed. She paused, collecting herself. But I also want to acknowledge something else. Justice was served this year. The people who stole you from me, who lied to all of us, who built their lives on our suffering, they faced consequences. Not because revenge heals anything, but because accountability matters, because the truth matters, because no one should be allowed to destroy a family and walk away unpunished. She raised her glass higher. To my daughters, who welcomed me into their lives with more grace than I had any right to expect. To my grandchildren, who have taught me that it is never too late to learn new things. To Rachel, who had the courage to tell the truth even though it meant exposing her own family's sins. to Detective Santos and everyone who fought for justice, and to all of you for giving an old woman a reason to believe that the world can still be fair, that wrongs can still be righted, that happy endings are possible even after the darkest of beginnings. On Margaret's 80th birthday, her entire family gathered at a rented estate in the hills above Portland. The guest list had grown substantially over the years. Her 2 daughters, their spouses, 5 grandchildren, 3 great-grandchildren with a 4th on the way, Rachel Peterson and her family, friends made through speaking engagements and foundation work, and Detective Santos, now retired, who had become something of a grandfather figure to the younger generation. The celebration lasted all day and into the evening, with food and music and speeches that made Margaret alternately laugh and cry. As the sun set, casting golden light across the gathering, Sarah stood and asked for everyone's attention. "Mom, we wanted to do something special for you this year. Something that would last longer than cake and presents." She gestured to Emma, who brought forward a large, flat object wrapped in cloth. "We commissioned this together. It took almost a year to complete." They unveiled the object, and Margaret gasped. It was a painting, oil on canvas, depicting a woman in a garden surrounded by children of all ages. The woman was clearly meant to be Margaret, though idealized and slightly younger than her current 80 years. The children represented every generation, Sarah and Emma as little girls, their children as teenagers, their grandchildren as toddlers. The background of the painting was filled with subtle symbols: a gold locket hanging from a tree branch, a stack of unopened letters tied with ribbon, a winding road that led from darkness into light. In one corner, barely visible, were the scales of justice, balanced and true. The overall effect was one of hope and accountability, a visual representation of a family that had been shattered, fought for justice, and rebuilt itself stronger than before. "It's called the Garden of Found Things," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "The artist spent months interviewing all of us, learning our stories, understanding what this family means. She wanted to capture not just who we are, but who we became because of you." Margaret stood before the painting, tears streaming down her cheeks, unable to speak. Finally, she turned to face her gathered family. "I spent most of my life believing I was the unluckiest woman in the world. I lost my children. I lost my husband. I lost 46 years to grief and uncertainty. There were times I wanted to give up, to stop fighting, to accept that my story would end in tragedy." She paused, looking at each face in turn. "But I was wrong. I was not unlucky. I was tested, and I did not give up. I kept fighting, kept searching, kept believing that the truth would eventually come out. And it did. Not just the truth about where my daughters were, but the truth about who took them, how they did it, and why. Justice was served. The people who destroyed our family faced consequences. And that matters. That matters more than I can express." She walked to the painting and touched the image of herself gently. "This is my legacy. Not the years of suffering, but the years of joy that followed. Not the loss, but the finding. Not the injustice, but the accountability. Not the end, but the new beginning." She turned back to her family with a smile that transformed her entire face. "I am 80 years old today. I have lived long enough to see miracles happen and justice served. I have watched the people who stole my children face the consequences of their actions. I have held my grandchildren in my arms and seen my great-grandchildren take their first steps. I have built a foundation that helps other families find their way back to each other. And I want you all to know that whatever happens next, whatever time I have left, I have already won. I found my daughters. I saw justice done. I watched my family grow and flourish. There is nothing more I could ask for." She raised her glass one final time. "To love, to truth, to justice, to second chances, and to never, ever giving up on the people who matter most." The crowd raised their glasses in response, voices calling out birthday wishes and words of love. Music started again, and people began to mingle, but Margaret stood for a moment longer, looking at the painting, at the garden of found things she had planted with hope, watered with tears, and finally seen bloom into something beautiful. 46 years ago, she had lost everything. Tonight, surrounded by the family that should have been impossible, watching the grandchildren who should never have known her name playing in the fading light. She understood that some losses are temporary, that some wounds heal, that some stories, no matter how dark their middle chapters, can still end in light. The people who had stolen her children were in prison or dead. The network that had enabled them was destroyed. Other families had been reunited because of her courage and persistence. And her daughters, her beautiful, grown, miraculous daughters, were right here beside her, calling her mom. She had found her children. She had found justice. She had found herself. And she had finally, after all those years, found peace. The stars came out over Portland, and the party continued late into the night, and Margaret Ellen Holloway, mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, advocate, and survivor, danced with her family until she was too tired to dance anymore. And then she sat and watched them dance for her, and she was happy. Completely, perfectly, finally happy.